Alright, YouTube, I've been following UK politics for some time, the politics of Great Britain, watching, our American C-SPAN does cover some of their legislative sessions, some of the speeches that their Prime Minister makes, and so forth. And of course, we just had a debate between Farage and Clegg, who are the leaders of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, and the Liberal Democrats over there in the UK. They had this debate on various issues so people could make their own decisions sort of going into the election. Apparently, the leaders of the other parties didn't want any part of it. I can understand why after having watched this. Um, I think that there may be some sort of disconnect between the politicians, sort of the political elite over there, and the average people on the streets. A significant one. And I've talked to people in Britain, and they basically say the same thing. They say politicians are corrupt. They are over here also. So that's, nothing bad about the British. Politicians are like that anywhere. But they seem to be corrupt in a slightly different way, in that it seems that this election seems to be pitting essentially UKIP and its belief that the Eurozone shouldn't be legislating these various European states to the level that it is, and that they should leave the EU, or at least I would assume drastically reform the way it operates. And everyone else that seems to be all on board with the idea that the EU is a great idea. Now, the EU, when it was originally envisioned and included fewer countries, was quite a good power. It included primarily these first world countries that were trading with one another and working together. Farage points this out. At that time, it worked fairly well. Then you get these other less advanced, not culturally advanced, but economically advanced countries with different economic systems, with different economic ideas joining this union, and it becomes a problem. And we've even seen this problem. I'll draw a comparison here in the United States. There are continual problems in this country from an economic standpoint, in that some states are more developed. Their economies are all over the place. You've got parts of the Midwest, they rely almost entirely on agriculture. You've got places in certain areas of the coast that rely heavily on trade and on industry. The Midwest is a great example. Detroit, Chicago, these cities are going broke because the trade dried up. That's the only reason they exist in the first place. Trade through the Great Lakes, through the Hudson, to Canada. It was a centralized location that made sense to ship parts and goods all over the United States because it's right in the center. It made movement more easy. Certainly ship is better than rail for that distance for some of those goods. And that's drying up. So we have the same problem in the United States that's being a problem in the EU, that you have these different areas. They have totally different economies based on totally different goods. They have different religious ideas. They have different cultural ideas. Until the EU and the Euro, they had different currencies. Everything's different about these countries. What you have is a net loss to some of these larger, more powerful EU nations, the UK and Germany especially, Norway and Sweden and France and sort of Belgium and Holland, these areas, the Netherlands to a lesser extent. You have money being siphoned out of them largely to some of these developing countries and these less developed but still first world nations like Spain, Greece, Italy, and so forth. The EU is causing problems, and I'm not surprised. Even if you look at it from the perspective of sort of the, I guess, the Liberal Democrats, Europe is sort of a solid force now. It's politically intertwined, and this is almost a succession if the UK leaves the EU. But from the perspective of the citizens of the UK, they're losing out. I'm not surprised that UKIP is rising to dominance when it is, when you do have problems with immigrants coming in and siphoning welfare. You have problems with they're losing investment opportunities. You have problems with criminal proceedings. You have problems with language. You have problems with everything. So even if the EU is to be considered largely a good arrangement, you can still understand why the actual citizens of these more advanced, more developed nations, more industrialized nations would look askance to this plan. The entire time, someone pointed this out in a comment that several things that Clegg said were out and out untrue. His claim that only 7% of the laws that are applied to business in the UK are actually made on an EU basis. The rest are crafted by the UK itself, which is wrong. And someone cited the actual EU Commission as being the one that said it was between 75 and 80%. Farage essentially got that. I believe he said 72, so he's not far off from the actual number, certainly closer than Clegg was. And a poll before the debate stated that something like 82% of people expected Farage to win. A poll conducted afterward showed that, yes, a majority of people thought Farage had won the debate. I thought he did too. I watched it live. The reason why I think this, beyond simply the facts, is that even from an American perspective, the EU appears to have largely failed. Partially because of the difference in these economies, partially because when you do, and we have, again, the same problem in the United States, when you have large bureaucratic groups governing these formerly completely independent regions, you're going to have two problems. Number one, they may act irrespective to the wants and needs of those individual states. And number two, things begin to break down as that regulation becomes stiffer and stiffer. We have the exact same problem in the United States, because our federal government over here has become prohibitively large and regulations have become prohibitively heavy for many businesses in this country. It has squished out parts of our economy. We've seen it happen. As opposed to letting the states largely run things, which works generally better. The idea of here's what should be done. It should take on, in both cases, whether it's the US or EU, it should take on the form of allowing businesses in these advanced countries to invest in infrastructure, in jobs creation, and so forth in the less fortunate nations. By this symbiotic relationship, you're creating jobs, you're driving up wages, you're modernizing some of these less advanced states, and yet you are still, in essence, creating a net gain in that parent country, that more advanced country. The same should be done here in the United States, by the way. The federal government should primarily limit itself beyond simply, obviously, providing for a military, providing for things like that, and providing regulation. Should stick to creating infrastructure, and maintaining the stability of the state, rather than making all of these ridiculous legislations and regulations that do nothing. Whether it's in regards to business, whether it's in regards to a person's personal life. For instance, we've got the drug war. It's failed. Well, there are similar drug laws in parts of Europe. They have failed also. You've got continued attempts at gun control. By the way, UKIP has largely put itself against the handgun ban in Britain. Bravo for them, to them for doing so, because, again, violent crime, gun crime dropped like a rock. Violent crime rose after they implemented that ban. Just as violent crime here in the United States began to rise when Bill Clinton endorsed an assault rifle ban. It rose because the criminals no longer had to deal with their prey being more weaponized than they were in many cases, because most gangs use handguns, or they use blunt instruments or knives. They're not going to walk into your home with a minigun. It's just not going to happen. And they'll have access to even those weapons if they truly wanted them, regardless of the laws, because those weapons happen to exist. And there are still gun crimes, by the way, in Europe, even in places where guns are illegal. I don't think most of the parties in the UK seem to understand this. From an American perspective, UKIP appears to be a more or less centrist party, which doesn't seem to lean very far in either direction, left or right. It leans, I guess, vaguely right on certain issues and vaguely left on others. The Liberal Democrats, by comparison, by what this individual was saying, appear to be more akin to what we would have in Bernie Sanders or somebody like that. Now, I like Sanders. I don't agree with a lot of his issues. I agree with him on some. But even then, there's a difference in that the other UK parties, which I've studied myself and looked at what they actually say and do, appear to be very authoritarian. They seem to think that the citizens of the UK don't know how to run their own lives and need everything dictated to them on a constant basis. And they lean far left on business proceedings. Well, would you look at what happened in Italy and Greece and Spain, and in Venezuela is another good example. You have these leftist economies that take a hard interventionist line, do not let private business run its own errands, and they falter and they get into debt. The United States has a similar problem right now, not because we have gone far left like some of the righties in this country believe, well, Obama's a communist or Obama's a Marxist or something. He's not. He's not actually nearly as far left as they believe. In fact, he's further right than somebody like Hillary, which seems to be who's gearing up for another run. But we suffer with that same problem because successive administrations have increased that regulation. Bush, who was apparently right-leaning, did the same thing and beefed up the military and beefed up this spending program and beefed up the surveillance apparatus, and we keep spending more and more money. We put people to work that do not create any jobs other than their own, that do not put money back into the private sector, that don't put money back into the coffers of taxation, that certainly aren't putting it back into the pockets of the little guy, and they simply absorb more and more money. The problem with the EU is the same as the problem with what we've done here in the US with our federal government, and what has happened in Venezuela, and what happened in Spain, and what happened in all of these other countries. What has happened is you have simply created a government which is too prohibitively large and powerful and concerned with more and more regulation for private businesses to be able to prop up a tax base. When that happens, you collapse. The UK should leave the EU. Or, conversely to that, if the UK were to work with some of these other more advanced nations, the Germans, the Norwegians, the French, that are starting to move a little bit more to the right themselves and abandon this same socialist ideology that's hurting their economies. The Germans, by the way, are the furthest right of that particular group, that echelon. If they were to work together, they might be able to reform the EU, and they might be able to reform the way in which it works, in such a way that it would allow these smaller and less powerful nations continue to advance while not siphoning large amounts off of the larger nations, and they might be able to work through it. But because of the cultural differences, that would probably be difficult to do. What they should do is dismantle the EU and create something else. It's a lot more simple. Simply get rid of the EU and all associated regulation. That burns all of those regulations and papers and so forth, and rules and laws and regulations, and create a new system. A new system for a new Europe that does respect these individual states and which structures them around a more capitalist ideology rather than simply siphoning money towards bureaucrats. Because again, that's the same problem we're having here. We've got so many agencies and so many little yes men running around, and so many little agents that are not actually producing anything, that they are just a burden to the economy. The NSA, the IRS largely functions in the same capacity. You've got all of these different groups, none of which are really building anything into the economy. They're simply taking from it. So then you have them going out and consuming, and yes, they're still going to buy a cheeseburger, they're still going to buy their pizza and their clothes and so forth. Most of that's being made in China. What we haven't done is build up a productive base here in the United States any more than the EU has. The EU does have lots of manufacturing jobs, as we do in the United States, but guess what? They're going to go elsewhere. They're going to go to where it's cheaper and less regulated. Farage is correct on that basis. And to think that the person he was debating with is one of the more sensible, more rational people in British politics. Imagine if he had been sitting aside from somebody from the Green Party. Somebody that's even further out in space and has no clue what's going on. When I see this, I say, I can understand why debates get heated in their parliament. I can understand why the British people probably have less respect for their government than even we do and constantly crack jokes about it. Because you look at these parties and you say most of them, they don't seem to have a clue what's going on. They're not living in the real world. I think the same thing, by the way, about both of the major parties in the United States. UKIP seems to be at least marginally a breath of... I don't think they go far enough. I will say the one thing Farage said that was slightly concerning. If I were a British citizen, this would be the one sticking point for me, is that he shied away from the question on gay marriage, because I happen to support gay marriage completely. And I side with the left on that particular issue. I have no problem with gays getting married. I do think Farage, however, there is a gem of truth in what he then said, which is, under the EU policies, churches within England would be forced to perform gay marriages even if it was against their ethics. As someone who lives in the United States with a view of separation between the church and state, that would be uncomfortable for me. And it would be equally uncomfortable to go to the other side and say no gay marriage for anyone. It should be. People should be able to get gay state marriages, and churches should be able to function as normal. That's my personal belief. I think it's a common sense, a rational belief. I don't think you necessarily need a church marriage. And certainly there are Christian churches that do perform gay marriages and have no problem doing that. And let these people go to churches where they'll be accepted. Anymore, if there was a church that claimed that eating meat was anti-spiritual, and you wanted to have a feast at your wedding that involved a large amount of meat, you probably wouldn't go to that church. It's essentially the same thing. There will be some who will probably point that out and say that's a mixed metaphor or something. But Farage obviously won this debate. He was more well-spoken. He was more precise and succinct. He actually had his figures straight, which I didn't know that it was 75% of their business-related laws are actually coming from an enclave of power that's outside of their own sovereign state. To somebody in the United States, that seems rather strange. Until, again, drawing another comparison, you understand that a lot of our laws from the federal level, a lot of our laws related to business also are at the federal level. They're not at the state level. States can essentially be regarded as similar, although not the same, as the European states, whereas the EU is to the United States sort of the federal arrangement. The problem being, the way in which Europe was structured already had nation and state, or province as it would more properly be, and therefore you've simply added another layer of potential corruption, not necessarily, but potential corruption, potential bureaucratic hand-wringing, potential insolvency as the result of various regulations that are passed. You have added an additional layer of potentially bad legislation that can harm business and which can harm these states' sovereignty. But the people of the UK, I think, would probably be better off with UKIP, probably be better off leaving the EU, because even from over here on this side of the pond, it is fairly clear there are large issues with the EU that don't seem to have been solved, despite the fact that they've existed for a number of years. It's not clear that any of these other parties really have solutions to this, other than the very real possibility through UKIP again that they would leave the EU entirely, at least until it is reformed or repealed and replaced in such a way that it's actually economically feasible. I think it's possible to do that. It would require a great deal of effort and cooperation, something which European states have a difficulty doing, just as our own states over here have an equal amount of difficulty doing. It's going to be hard to get someone from Oklahoma to agree with someone from Connecticut. It's just the way it is. These people, I think, in Europe would be better off. They can trade, and they can compromise, and they can cooperate, and they can move around in the way that they currently do, but without all of the bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy, above all else, will stifle a nation. Look to Rome, and you can see very similar things happening to what you see in not just the Western world, not just the US and EU, but also, to some extent, in Russia and its allies like Venezuela. Even in China now, they're having this problem with strangulating their own businesses. In the other direction, you have states which are so laissez-faire, and there's no regulation, and they exploit all their resources and collapse. The same can be done on the other side. You can be too regulated, and it can crush an economy. I think Farage won this debate. It would be interesting if UKIP became the large party in the UK. I think it would be beneficial for the British. And I can just imagine there will probably be people now who will attack me for saying this, and number one, because I'm not in the UK, so what do you know about it, you stupid American? Go eat your cheeseburger. Number two, that because I do that, I must be homophobic and racist, or some combination thereof, none of which is actually true, but I can foresee it coming. Peace out.